This is KHPR, the Voice of Darkness podcast. I'm Magistra Robert Adams, your host, who will be accompanying you on your journey. So get ready, sit back, relax, and prepare to Kepher and remanifest. This is Magistra Robert Adams, and while it's been some time since our last show, I'd like to let you know that we haven't gone away, but are back now with an interview I'm sure you'll enjoy. Adept Simon Liddell talks with our former high priest, Magistra Pat Hardy, on her journey to becoming the high priest of the Temple of Set and what she has brought to the temple during her time as high priest. I think you'll enjoy this interview.
This is Adept Simon L., and I'm here today with the High Priest Emeritus of the Temple of Set, Magistra Pat Hardy, and today we're going to be discussing some of the contributions that she has made to the temple, as well as discussing some of the initiatory work that she has done within the organization. So thanks for being here today, Patty.
You're welcome. I'm very pleased to be here.
Excellent. And with any good interview, probably the best place to start is the beginning. So I thought as an opening question, it might be kind of neat to ask, what's your first memory? What's the earliest thing you remember doing?
Well, there are fragments that are difficult to place, but one of them involves seeing a mobile of some kind that my parents had placed above my crib. At least I'm pretty sure that this was what the situation was, that there was something that I was looking at that fascinated me, and I reached for it. There are things like that, and when I look at that, I wonder if that's somehow connected with my later interest in astronomy, the idea of trying to grasp the unreachable. Perhaps there's something there, too, about my interest in the esoteric. There are later memories. One of the most vivid, I was the sort of child who took a very deep interest in nature, even though I lived in a city, and most of my environment was covered with concrete. One day, my playmates were all scandalized by a fat green caterpillar that they had encountered, covered with bright yellow and red ornaments. This strange-looking object, this strange-looking crawly thing. I thought this was cool, and I put it in a sand bucket and took it home. My parents said, "No, get rid of it." So, of course, I put it in the tree in the backyard. That didn't make them any happier, but it vanished, and I didn't see any sign of it again until winter, when I found a cocoon in the branches of that cherry tree. We brought it inside. I pointed it out to my parents. They relented. They let me bring it inside and put it in a jar on the porch. I forgot about it until mid-spring. I remember helping my brother hauling in a toy dinosaur up the stairs of the porch when I saw it and started shrieking. My parents came out to find out what was going on. The cocoon was opening. There was a huge, colorful moth that was stretching its wings. I showed my parents the picture of the moth in the books that I had. I knew what sort of moth it was. And they said, "This moth only lives for a few days. Now you have to take it out into the yard and let it go, because it doesn't have much time." So we did that. We took it out. And I remember thinking how strange that something so beautiful lasted for so short a time. But it was time enough for me to see it.
Wonderful. So you began with an initial sense of wonder. You weren't terribly afraid of those things which were ooky and creepy, which the other children were afraid of, and it led to a wonderful experience of watching something transform before you. Well, that's a pretty wonderful metaphor for setting an initiation, if ever I heard one. On the subject of setting initiation, what was it that brought you to the Temple of Set?
That's a good question. I recall becoming convinced during my late teen years that there was something not well understood about the mind. My interests were in science and engineering, but I was always aware that there was something more. And I began looking into that. It happened that my mother had a book on yoga. She was mostly interested in the exercises, the hatha yoga, the exercises to keep one flexible and young. I was fascinated by the section on meditation and contemplation. That led me eventually to the doors of magic by way of the works of Aleister Crowley, which were first being republished in the 70s. And I began reading these books. I also had a profound interest in science fiction. I encountered the work of H.P. Lovecraft. And this gave me another perspective on the radical unknown and people's responses to it. For many years, I pursued these things in solitude. I was an armchair magician, although I did try various of the exercises. I did try writing various rituals and performing them. I had gotten to the point, I seem to recall Aleister Crowley describes one ritual where one writes a series of invocations to a god from different perspectives.
Libra Starter.
Yes. And I did this. I did this for Shakopili, the Aztec Prince of Flowers. I may be mispronouncing the Nahuatl. And I pursued this and other things. And eventually, I arrived at the place where I had to find someone else to talk to about this. That you can't pursue magic in solitude. You can't assess what you're doing in solitude. And at that point, I had gone off to college. I had begun doing, I began working during, working as a temp at a computer company during the summer. I encountered other people who were interested in magic. Some of them were Thelemites. Eventually, I arrived at the point where I decided to explore both the Temple of Set and the OTO, the local OTO chapter. This was by dint of a curious train of events. I had read some of the books of Kenneth Grant. I read this and I said, oh, well, you know, good drugs, man. However, there were things in the book, The Magical Revival. Mm-hmm. There were things in the book that struck me as worthy of exploration. That led me to one of his sources, Gerald Massey, and his discussion of Seth as the god of night, and his significance to the ancient Egyptians, his role as the initiatory devil in Egyptian thought. And I was fascinated by all of this. I encountered a copy of the temple's general information letter in the CompuServe religious forum. I may have been one of the first people to join the temple by dint of having found a document on the early internet. Huh. And I wrote, I said, this seems to me, it may be too good to be true. This sounds like these are the people I am looking for. And so I wrote a kind of magical resume or curriculum vitae describing the various things I had done over the years. And wrote a cover letter. And I remember thinking, you know, I'm probably going to ruin my life. I thought about it for a long time. Eventually, I worked up my courage and sent in the application. And a few weeks later, I recall receiving the letter of acceptance and a copy of the crystal tablet. And I read it and I said, why, these are the people I've been looking for all along. During this same time, I met a number of Thelemites in the New England area. One of them was a coworker, and she was the camp mistress of Apotheosis Camp in Ashby, Massachusetts. And we had a number of conversations, and I thought that simply because of the insight that I had gained from reading and working with Aleister Crowley's material, that it was worth my affiliation with the camp, although I did not continue long in that initiatory system. I did take my Minerval, the first and second degrees.
Well, and it's kind of funny that you did happen to come to the Temple of Set by way of Kenneth Grant, considering his own, I suppose, affiliations with the god Set as sort of a counterpoint to Horus, particularly in some of his early writings. And also, I would add, I guess, an addendum to it. I also was a large fan of Kenneth Grant's work prior to my own affiliation with the Temple of Set. I dare say it was maybe one of the driving things that helped me find this place. But though there isn't necessarily the greatest amount of historical truth or accuracy in that, there is a certain amount of legitimacy and authenticity to the work that comes out there. And if I were going to say, one of the grand things that the Temple has been capable of borrowing from some of Kenneth Grant's work, and definitely some of the work of Crowley and some of the offshoots that have occurred in Great Britain and the United States, it's trying to bring some of the authentic ideas that a person would have coming out of those particular camps, and trying to bring further legitimacy to those through great practice. Now, on that particular subject of practice, and where you went with your initiation after you joined the Temple of Set, you're also a member of the Order of the Trapezoid, and if I recall correctly, the Grand Master Emeritus of that order. Would you be so kind as to speak to some of your work with the OTR, particularly some of the Starry Wisdom material that you have so graciously brought to us here?
Yes. My interest in the Order of the Trapezoid grew out of two things. First of all, as I remarked earlier, I was fascinated by the work of H.P. Lovecraft. In particular, I was intrigued by the fact that H.P. Lovecraft was clearly a person of great intellectual powers, and the stories he told were from the standpoint of rational narrators encountering extraordinary, irrational, transcendent things. However, he did this in a way that impressed me, because he always wove in his tales, amid the fantastic, very mundane things, very recognizable things. As an example, in The Call of Cthulhu, the narrator is unwrapping a geologic specimen and discovers the truth about a sea voyage that he had learned of earlier in a newspaper print. He was unwrapping the specimen, the geologic specimen, in Paterson, New Jersey. The Paterson Geological Museum is a real place. It had one of the most impressive collections of fluorescent minerals on the East Coast. H.P. Lovecraft had visited the Patterson Geological Museum for a job interview. When I read the story, I realized that I knew the place that he was describing. One of the impressive things he did as a writer was to constantly interweave the real and the fantastic. The Order of the Trapezoid pursued what it called neo-mythology, the art and science of working with self-created myths in order to broaden one's horizons. And the work of H.P. Lovecraft was one of the examples, one of the exemplars that the Order of the Trapezoid looked to. The second thing that intrigued me about the Order of the Trapezoid was its treatment of time. It looked to the past, it looked to history, it looked to the genetic past in its Magica Genitiva work, where one explores the magic of family and family tradition. But it also explored the future through workings of time travel, through explorations of science fiction. And these things together, the power of fantastic fiction and the interest in time, were things that drew me to the Order of the Trapezoid. I affiliated with the Order of the Trapezoid shortly after being recognized an adept of the Temple of Set, and continued working with the range, the whole spectrum of initiatory tools in the Order of the Trapezoid for several years. I was ultimately appointed the Grand Master, and for a time led the Order of the Trapezoid on its explorations into some of these areas. I was particularly interested in H.P. Lovecraft's concept of starry wisdom. In order to understand the depth of some of the things he wrote about, it's important to understand that H.P. Lovecraft was an amateur astronomer, and that such things as the shining trapezohedron in his story, The Haunter of the Dark, are transfigurations of the prism of a telescope, which brought him in contact with a universe incalculably vast compared to the mundane, everyday experience of the people around him in Providence. He felt himself an alien, something of another world. And it was in this that I began to consider how the night sky had affected so many individuals over the course of humanity's past. How this went back perhaps to the very beginning. Now, other people have glimpsed this truth. If you look at the novel 2001, you discover that the novel opens with a curious ape nicknamed Moonwatcher, who spends a lot of time contemplating the stars and the moon, these things that are so far from terrestrial experience. And the story weaves a link between that and humanity's future among the stars, something very vividly illustrated in Stanley Kubrick's cinematic rendition of the story. I began considering that there was something about the left-hand path, about its aesthetics, that was not well understood, that Most people thought of the interest in darkness, the unknown, solitude, as somehow mere antipathy to daylight, to ordinary socialization and the like. But I began to see something different about this, that the courage that it took to go off by yourself and just look at the stars, and the idea that people might have learned much simply by doing this, began to make me think that I had a handle on something about the psyche that other people had overlooked.
Well, that's possibly one of the major differences with the Temple of Set as it is now as compared to whenever it first began. And it moved out of the falling out with the Church of Satan. Rather than simply being contrarian, perhaps what we have turned to look at is something a bit more transcendent. Having the immense experience of trying to reach beyond what it is that we currently are and not just reject what currently is.
I agree. And there is something I understood about this some years ago, that very metaphysical level, if you look at the right-hand path religions, the religions of the day side, you have all creation under a single cosmic figure, the image of the sun. The sun dominates biology. One of the distinctions between the right-hand path and the left-hand path is mirrored in this dichotomy of solar and stellar. The right-hand path takes its cue from the sun, which defines the times, orders human life, dominates agriculture, that basically the sun is the prototype for cosmic order, the metaphysics of the right-hand path. The left-hand path is stellar. You look to the night sky. There are multiple points of light. There are suns scattered through the sky, each of them a diamond center. Each of them a sun around which whole solar systems revolve. The left-hand path is of essence stellar. The individual is a star. Every man and every woman is a star. That the self is the gravitational center of worlds, but that there's not one. There are many. That such a worldview also grants a kind of liberty to one's fellow beings that can never exist in a solar worldview.
So a celebration of plurality,
Yes.
instead of more of a mono-oriented or singular-oriented concept of divinity.
Yes.
I definitely agree with you on that particular point. The constellations of stars within our temple, and even among some of the really gifted occultists and magicians without, who do embrace some of these left-hand path concepts, have enriched me in my own initiatory work, even without taking the place of the divinity of what it is that I've been trying to become. So I can definitely see where you're coming from on that, in that respect with the starry wisdom material. So where else has that line of thought led you in your initiatory work?
Well, it branched off into two lines of development. Along one of these lines, I began looking closely at the ancient Egyptian word sba. This word has at least 3 meanings. It means star, it means door, and it means teach. The last meaning, teach, can be derived from treating the word as saba, which is to make a ba. The ba being the center of personality and individuality in Egyptian soul lore.
So not to vulgarize the concept, but it in a very real sense means to impart a soul, to impart the ba upon something.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I looked at these 3 meanings. I asked myself, what common thread is there to these things? What were the Egyptians thinking? Gerald Massey tells us that language, especially metaphysical language, is fossil metaphor. What led the Egyptians, what experiences caused the Egyptians to link these 3 concepts? I asked, what experience led the Egyptians to treat these 3 concepts as interlinked? That led me into a close look at how cosmology shapes human thought. It led me to the area of archaeoastronomy and ethnoastronomy. Basically, how ancient people explained what they saw in the sky, and more importantly, how they used their experience of the sky to wield power on Earth. Now, everyone involved in occultism or esoteric studies is aware of astrology. Depending on the depth of their knowledge, they may or may not grasp that this was one of the eldest of the black arts, and that the first person to be able to advise a ruler, a chieftain, on when to expect the migration of the herds, or when to plant grain in order to ensure a good harvest. These things derived from watching the rise of constellations night after night. That these things actually conferred power and were the root of the whole flowering of what we now consider to be astrology. The first astrologers were planning and policy wonks, that they wielded effective power because they understood the cycles that governed human life.
Certainly. Well, and in addition to that, with the scholarly study of the discipline of how people viewed the night sky, you have a very commonly observed thing, which is the very consistent night sky. And you can track how culture, language, and all of those things affected their the perception of those people who were encountering that.
Yes, the psyche functions as a prism, that you get a single experience, an element of the objective world, which is transformed by human desire and necessity and reshaped into scientific knowledge, myth, religion, a whole range of structures of thought, a diverse range of structures of thought. And the study of this leads you to think of the night sky as a mirror in which the psyche sees itself. It learns to see itself through this external set of phenomena. The ideas drawn from it, the theories taken and applied, all of these things are aspects of the psyche coming to see and understand its own power. This is an aspect of this idea of spa, that the stars not only are out there, but they're in their interior reflection. We come to be able to see ourselves. The second branch, I spoke of two branches that this took me on. The second branch this took me on was, in fact, the careful study of how different societies looked to, utilized, and understood the night sky. In the case of Egypt, there's a great deal of speculation and a kind of divergence one sees. People look to the creations of ancient Egypt, their material accomplishments. They find this extraordinary and build elaborate theories of their understanding of the night sky based on these things. On the other hand, you have the scholarly academic study of Egypt, which is necessarily quite conservative in its understanding. And it was in the process of looking at how the ancient Egyptians used the night sky, how they aligned their monuments, how they organized their agricultural labor, how they interpreted the role of the pharaoh as an intermediary between heaven and earth, that I came to an extraordinary insight. Now, I'm going to stop for a moment and talk about the last of these three things. Pharaoh's function as an intermediary between the two realms. Very early in the historical record, in the second dynasty, I believe, there is a description, in the time of the Pharaoh Den, a description of the priests of the goddess Seshat overseeing or initiating the foundation of a temple. They had a foundation ceremony known as the stretching of the cord. There are descriptions of this ceremony that appear in fragmentary forms and in graphical forms and inscriptions on walls throughout the 1500 years or so of ancient Egypt's history. This ceremony involved the pharaoh, assisted by the goddess of temple records and writing, Sheshat, sighting a particular star in the northern sky and using it to align a cord stretched between two stakes. It was basically a surveying line to ensure that the foundation was true.
So a combination of the magical and the practical.
Yes, yes, the magical and the practical. And the pharaoh spoke an incantation during this rite, this foundation ceremony, asserting his role as the one who brought law from heaven to earth with the assistance of the goddess of writing and temple records and with the assistance of the stars of the night sky. That is to say, they recognized that their ideas of order were derived from their experience of the night sky, and that, as far as they were concerned, knowledge was power. That what legitimized power was not power itself, but knowledge. This is something that I think people don't always think about. That power for its own sake does not have the kind of endurance that we see in the pyramids. Many cultures have risen and fallen, and the people who ruled them thought that they were the bee's knees, that they had it all. But without knowledge, their attainments were lost on the winds of time. Now, all of this led me to a profound respect for what these people so far away in time and space from me, a profound respect for them. I was therefore baffled by academic papers that suggested that the ancient Egyptians knew very little about astronomy or the sky. And I was particularly struck one day when visiting the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. I went to the gift shop and found a copy of a book called The Tomb of Seti I. It's a set of photos, large format photos, taken by a museum photographer, covering almost every square inch of the tomb of Seti I. I flipped through this, and I came to a page, and my mouth fell open. Above the sarcophagus, there was what Egyptologists call an astronomical ceiling. I looked at the photos, and I said, why is there a chart of the constellations of the night sky above this sarcophagus? We're not talking about an ornamental picture. This was a chart. It was annotated in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Uh-huh. It was a spreadsheet.
It was not merely a work of art. It was a technical document.
It was annotated. It had 36 columns. It was annotated with hieroglyphic inscriptions, notes apparently on particular stars. The clustering of stars was sufficient for me to recognize, as an amateur astronomer, recognize what parts of the sky these were. And yet, Egyptologists, academic Egyptology, held that there was no certain identification for any of these sectors of the sky with particular stars. And I looked at that and I said, something is wrong here.
Well, leave it to a magician to notice the combination of technical skill, artistry, magical thinking, political thought, and all of those things amalgamated to one location, and to then make a connection that others who only would have one part of that available to them do.
Entirely understood. Mm-hmm. That was the beginning of a 10-year pursuit. I drafted a paper on this image. I spoke with a postdoc from the University of California in LA, went over this material, and realized that the problem was that this material was all in a funerary context. And so it was very easy to assume that it was purely ornamental or symbolic. That what I needed was to find a document intended for the living. And how I did so was rather strange itself. There is a document that is commonly known as the Cairo calendar. Mm-hmm. Its actual hieroglyphic name is something like the Book of the Beginning of Eternity and the End of Infinity. Actually, the Book of the Beginning of Infinity and the End of Eternity. However, it is a daybook or calendar. It was thought to be a book of lucky and unlucky days. It is a truly incomprehensible document when read with this as your understanding, as with this filter for what it is. It consists of daily entries. It begins by dividing the day into 3 and telling you whether each third is lucky or unlucky. Mm-hmm. And it then gives some scraps of lore, seemingly mythological lore for that day, very little of which seems to make sense. Mm. But there's mention of various feasts and mythological incidents. And I was paging through this and thinking, well, this is kind of strange. Mm-hmm. And I came to one passage that explained about how on this day it was the going forth of Neith, the goddess Neith, and the night when they see her beauty in the night for 4.5 hours. Now I looked at that and I said, what does this mean?
Well, it's painfully specific.
The footnotes claimed that the going forth in this context was a procession in which a statue of the god or goddess was carried between the temples through the streets. And I could not help but wonder if they were accompanied by people with sand clocks telling them to pick up the pace because they only had 4.5 hours to do this. Mm-hmm. Needless to say, I looked at this and I said, what beauty did they see in the night for 4.5 hours? I was an amateur astronomer. I had plenty of planetarium software on my computer. It didn't take a lot to realize that the person was describing the appearance of the star Canopus on that night.
Fabulous.
Canopus is the second brightest star in the sky after Sirius, and the going forth of Sirius is recognized as the beginning of the ritual calendar because the reappearance of this star signaled the opening of the Egyptian year and also predicted the rising of the Nile waters a few weeks later. So it was the beginning of the yearly cycle. Everybody knew, all the Egyptologists were agreed, that that star was identified with the goddess Sothis. Mm-hmm. But because the second brightest star couldn't be seen from most points in Europe, no one had ever bothered to ask, what were all of these? There were 42 other instances of going forth in this document. I looked for the other instances. There were 3 other instances of the going forth of Neith. All of them had to do with astronomical events involving the star Canopus. I wrote a paper. I sent it to the Journal of Archaeoastronomy, University of Texas Press.
Yes.
Journal of Archaeoastronomy.
Peer-reviewed.
Yes, a peer-reviewed scientific journal on archaeoastronomy. I sent this to the editor with a polite note saying that I thought there was something they should know. I received back a letter saying that it appeared that this was well argued, but these were only 3 of the 42 cases, and that I couldn't just explain 3 of them. That would be cherry picking.
Yeah.
And I wrote back that I had no intention of stopping. I just wanted to be sure that my methodology was sound. It took a couple of years going back and forth with peer review. It was a very curious experience because the peer reviewer that they chose could tell that I was not an Egyptologist. I was not a historian of science. I was not an archaeologist. I knew too much about certain things. not enough about others, that things you would expect
Yeah.
for people in that field. Nevertheless, he was impressed and wanted a fuller exposition of certain things, which I delivered. The paper was published in the 2002-2003 volume.
And it's still available.
Yes.
I found it in academic libraries myself.
Yes. And you can also, you can get it through JSTOR.
Oh, yes. But this actually highlights another aspect of what, particularly in the Temple of Set, but, I'd say among learned magicians, constitutes a genuine initiatory experience.
Yes.
You didn't have a mystical insight that maybe created a connection between one part of your subjective self and another part of your subjective self, but rather through the ordeal of becoming a magician, of being initiate, of doing the initiatory work as we do it, you came to realizations about the world, not just within yourself, but who it is that you are can interact with the world outside of yourself. And in turn, this led to some rather profound understandings of the mesocosmos, the sociological circumstance under which these ideas were constructed.
Well, yes. Mm-hmm. One of the things that I learned out of this experience, the number of people who claim to have had insights about ancient Egypt or the wisdom of other ancient cultures. There are a huge number of people who have made such claims. Where they stop is the process of deciding what that means and what they want to do about it. I could have turned away and said, I've got a secret, and impart this secret to only my students. But what I had found was something that I thought was important to others and changed their understanding in turn. So I did the further work, and the process of doing the work gave me further insights. For example, one of the things that disturbed me, even after I was delighted to be published, but it disturbed me. How could I have found this where people who had spent their lives in these fields had overlooked this? How could this be? Though I found one scholar, Christian Lietz, in his translation of the Cairo calendar, came very close to the insight that some of this material was astronomical. And in discussing this with another Setian, I realized that there were two things that were working in my favor. One was that because I practiced a rational religion, I didn't stop when I encountered something that didn't make sense. Mm-hmm. Most people, when they encounter something that's presented in the framework of religion, they say, that doesn't have to make sense. It's a religious belief.
Or it doesn't.
It belongs to some other realm. We don't have to know about that. And they translate it into their understanding.
If it doesn't fit within the preconceived notion of how it works, then it's an invalid.
Yes, they overlook it.
It's invalid somewhere for a reason.
Yes, they don't see it. They just don't see it. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that was going in my favor was that as a magician, I saw the Egyptians thought on their terms and was not content with the idea that, that some priest pulled this out of his ass in order to impress people. That was one thing, that being an initiate caused me to understand the concept of initiation in other cultural contexts and what it might mean. The second thing was that I became aware of the volatility of what we regard as fixed knowledge. It only took about 10 or 15 years for the technology to advance to the point when Christian Leitz was writing, if he guessed that it might be astronomical, but to prove it would have required $250,000 of compute power and a staff of graduate students. For me, it was a Macintosh and some off-the-shelf planetarium software and some persistence.
Mm-hmm.
So the other thing that I drew out of this was the idea of taking known, the knowledge for granted, taking the known understanding of the world for granted is a very dangerous thing. The rate of change is such that you must not assume that what people understand today is what they will understand of things even a few years hence. This is definitely an age of tremendous dynamism, which is one of the things about the Aeon of Set.
Oh, yeah.
Tremendous dynamism, to the point where some people fear it as chaotic. No, it's a place of great flexibility and great possibility.
Absolutely.
So this was the second branch of my understanding of starry wisdom, which translated into an actual academic paper. In the course of this, as well as my magical work, I became aware that it was going to be, just as earlier, you can't be an armchair magician by yourself.
Mm-hmm.
You can't write papers about ancient Egypt and get them published and never set foot in Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that.
So, Magister Hardy, on the subject of Egypt in your travels there, I understand there are some kind of peculiar circumstances and some other workings within the Temple of Set that helped, not convince you, but helped you decide to start traveling around Egypt. Would you mind speaking to that a bit?
Oh, yes. It was in 1994 that Don Webb introduced the Festival of Isidora. Mm-hmm. If you pick up a copy of his book, 7 Faces of Darkness, you'll find that this is listed among the 4 festivals that Setians can celebrate.
That he has suggested.
That Setians celebrate. The Festival of Isidora is about making sure the gate to the past stays open. He was inspired in this by a historical event and a story that he heard about it. The historical event is that we have an inscription at the Temple of Philae in Upper Egypt. An inscription which is believed to be the last hieroglyphic inscription of ancient Egypt. It is dated August 24th of what we now know as the year 394. It is written in somewhat bad hieroglyphic and somewhat not elegant and timeless like the earlier ones, but scratched into the stone by someone who was a priest of Isis and who asserted that he was faithful and yet served the goddess. He was writing at a time when the Romans had shut down all support for the Egyptian temples, which were the centers of hieroglyphic literacy. Basically, they decided to rule Egypt by decapitating the intellectual class. We know from other historical instances that the Egyptian temples were regarded as strongholds of Egyptian nationalism and cultural centers, and that this made it difficult for conquerors. The Romans had extinguished hieroglyphic literacy elsewhere. This was probably one of the last people who could read and write the hieroglyphs.
So then the actual act in this little side chapel in Philae
Yes.
Of writing this hieroglyphic inscription was a very antinomian and also probably very dangerous activity for the person who did write it.
Don Webb learned of this. He also learned of a Coptic Christian priest who boasted that God had swept away all of this paganism under the waters. And Don Webb, being the magician he is, decided that it was time for the waters to recede and for the door to the past not only to open, but to be wedged open by the acts of magicians for time to come. He wrote the Festival of Isidora. I was one of the individuals who performed the working, the ritual, for the first time. One of the features of this working is that in addition to the magical work, one is to anchor the work in the world by finding and supporting some institution that helps keep the door to the past open. In my case, this proved to be done through my interactions with Egyptologists and with various Egyptological groups. By dint of this, I was fortunate to learn of tours of Egypt that went beyond the usual tourist exposition of the Great Pyramids and the Sphinxes, the statues of Luxor and what have you, but went into depth, that went to parts of Egypt, to archaeological sites where actual work was being done by scholars, places where extraordinary things had happened in the past. My first trip was in 2000. I went on one of these tours, and with a few days left over, I and my husband flew to the Western Desert, which we knew to have been the stronghold of the cult of Set in pharaonic times. Indeed, Set continued to be honored in these oases, the oases of Karga, Dakhla, Bahariya, long after the name of this god was cursed along the Nile. So I had the opportunity to visit some of these places, to photograph them, to stand in these places where anciently there were actual temples of Set. And it was an extraordinary experience. That was in 2000. One of the curious things that happened on my return was that, anxious to learn more about these places, I stumbled on a fact that seemed to be unknown to anyone else in the Temple of Set, that a figure of the goddess Nephthys had been uncovered at Der El Hagar, a site in Dakhla Oasis, that this figure, it had been a piece of gilded temple statuary. It had been, of course, scraped free of, the gold had been scraped off by robbers. However, the inscriptions remained intact on the back of the statue. This statue of Nephthys turned out to be a votive offering that had been donated to the temple by a specific person, and the person identified himself as Penbast, that is to say, he of Bast, and mentioned his title, High Priest of Set. Up until that point, we did not have information, historical information, about individuals of the ancient temple of Set. Now, since then, a lot has been discovered. We've managed to uncover a lot of bits of information in out-of-the-way places, in Egyptological texts and excavation reports. But this was, for me, a most extraordinary moment. Suddenly, the ancient temple of Set stopped being an imaginal entity and started being a part of the world that I had walked through. That was an extraordinary thing. The other interesting thing about Deir el-Hagar was that this site had been restored by a Canadian team of Egyptologists. The sanctuary had partly fallen in. They recovered the pieces of the ceiling and reassembled it outside the sanctuary. It was an astronomical ceiling, the last one, built around 56 AD, or the Common Era. The temple itself is small. It is apparently built by the Emperor Vespasian, and there is an inscription or a drawing, a scene in the walls of the temple, in which Vespasian offers flowers to Set and Nephthys. So we have here the combination, again, of the stellar cult, an astronomical ceiling, the temple, and the worship of Set. It was 4 years later that I returned to Egypt, this time on a tour that included the oases of the Western Desert as part of the itinerary. It began in Cairo. I made a point of stopping before the tour proper got underway. The group was taken to the Cairo Museum, and I made a point of stopping and paying my respects to the Stele of Revealing, no longer numbered 666, but there, in a case in the shadows. And my husband and I traveled with the group by bus, first to Siwa Oasis.
So just as a point of reference, that would have occurred in 2004,
yes.
Is that correct? And incidentally, just for those who are thalamically inclined, that would be the 100th anniversary of the reception of the Book of the Law.
Yes.
Which is why Cairo, the same location where that happened.
Which is why I decided to pay my respects to the Stele.
Please carry on.
Yes. The bus took us to Siwa Oasis, where we stayed for a time. This is a most extraordinary oasis on the western edge of Egypt. It is best known for the Temple of Amun, the Oracle of Amun, which is located on the outskirts of this oasis. I mentioned before that the Egyptian priesthood had a very strong influence on cultural continuity in Egypt. It was the Oracle of Amun that denounced the Persian invasion of Egypt from afar and led the Persian emperor to send 10,000 troops to silence that mouthy oracle. They set out across the desert. They never made it. From time to time, one hears accounts of the discovery of rusted weapons and bones, but no one is still sure that the lost battalion was ever found. However, in contrast, when Alexander the Macedonian arrived, the priests of the oracle welcomed him, said they'd been expecting him, that he was a son of Ammon, and that would he kindly, take charge of Egypt, throw out those Asiatics who claimed to be, running the place, and may the laurel leaves of victory be with him.
My, isn't that a politically expedient magical act?
It was. It was. He duly marched through, and that was the last they had to deal with him. Mm-hmm. So, today, of course, the oracle is there's little left of it but a small stone sanctuary. We were able to visit it and reflect on how this place had changed history and wonder what oracles must have been whispered. Our trip took us through the western desert. We were offloaded and put on jeeps because we were going to follow one of the desert roads, too rough for a bus. We traveled a full day to reach the oasis of Farafa, a small oasis near Baharia. All of these oases are shrinking. The Sahara continues to dry. However, we had the opportunity to cross the desert and understand something of how the Egyptians must have feared the desert. At one point, we disembarked, and I stood on one of the sandbanks and picked up a handful of the sand. This isn't the sand of our beaches, pieces of crumpled limestone. This sand was broken flint and obsidian. This is the sand that takes the flesh off your bones during sandstorms. This is why the Egyptians feared the desert and feared storm. We had the opportunity to stay in Baharia, again to stay in Dakhla and in Karga, visiting the several archaeological sites in each of these places. Karga is the site of a high-security prison and is still as feared a place for most Egyptians as it was in pharaonic times, when its title was the place to which we deport. Again, though, I understood something about the deceptive nature of appearances while in Karga. There are a number of mastabas, these stone structures, like stepped pyramids, that were built as mortuary temples for the governors in the Old Kingdom. And I remember looking at these huge structures, which are surrounded by desolation, and wondering. And it wasn't until some time after that I realized what was bothering me, that in the time when these things were built in the Old Kingdom, these areas were green and covered with crops, with wheat fields, palm trees. These were places full of life that even over the course of 4,000 years, I could look at this and not see or fail to appreciate at first the fact that what I was seeing could not have been done under the current circumstances. And perhaps that's the thing that makes Egypt so difficult to understand, that we take for granted when we look at something, when we look at a place. We figure it's always been that way. It's always been what we see. And in fact, over the course of time, things change all out of recognition, and then people are mystified by what remains. A tip of the hat to climate change.
Yeah. The same would be said for a lot of Mesoamerican religions and the civilizations that were built around all of those. Certainly some of the areas in further areas in the Middle East and other seats of civilization that we would get that. Maybe that's possibly one of the most difficult things within the occult community, and those people who tend to try to borrow from a lot of those things is they do have to take a lot of those things out of the context from which they actually developed, and that's a huge, very difficult thing that scholarly study can help facilitate, whereas a lack of that tends to cause some very large lacks.
A lack of that will
work.
A lack of that distorts your understanding of the symbolism of the texts. You don't understand what the magicians who wrote these things meant because you don't understand what it meant to them. And while, yes, you can project your own understandings and bring these things to life in your subjective universe, there's considerable power in understanding where they were coming from when they did these things. What did it mean to them? And then understanding how they used symbols in their world to accomplish what they desired. You are in a better place to look around you and understand how the symbols and structures of your own time and place can be manipulated. That is one of the things that I learned looking at the work of Gerald Massey, who was one of the writers that Kenneth Grant drew on. Gerald Massey hammered on a concept he described as the physical nature of the gnosis. For him, knowledge was not mystical. It spanned the planes. And unless your knowledge spanned the planes, you were only working with part of it. You did not have the whole. You did not understand fully. I can give an example. While visiting Dakhla Oasis, I stopped at a pottery. It's an open-air pottery, which could well have been a scene out of pharaonic Egypt, except for the rubber water hose connected to a faucet in one corner of the area. There was a huge number of pots awaiting firing, different kinds of pots, including some that I recognized from Egyptological inscriptions. They were making the pots as they always had. And I saw the kiln, this open-air hearth, and the fuel stacked around it. And when I saw this, I recalled that one of the earlier high priests of the Temple of Set used the metaphor of the initiate who works his soul through magic. The metaphor compared the initiate to pots to be fired. I understand that this high priest, the second high priest, Ronald K. Barrett, was asked, well, how do you know where you are in that process? Because it was Ronald K. Barrett's theory that the firing was essentially an ordeal process, that one had to go through difficulties and dangers. One had to seek them out for the firing of the soul. And he was asked, how do you know when it's enough? And he did not have an answer. I thought that was extraordinary, that you would build your teachings around a metaphor like that, but apparently never have fired a pot. So, being in this place with potters who had apparently continued to practice pottery in the old style, I approached one and asked, you cover these pots with this fuel, you fire the pots. How do you know when the pots are done? And he looked at me and he said, why, the smoke changes color. And I just stood there for a moment thinking, well, first of all, obviously, as a from a material science point of view, yes, all of the impurities would have been burned away and the smoke would change color. The other part of me was going, but, what does this have to do with the tradition of the Pope and the Vatican? Has this symbolism been used elsewhere in religion? So it was a very curious example of how the lack of the actual experiential knowledge of how to fire a pot led to a deficiency in the use of the magical metaphor. How do you know when you've done enough? How do you know when it's time to quit making your life miserable and do something else? Well, you got to know where the metaphor comes from in order to accurately guide its use as a magical tool. So, overall, my experience of the oases gave me considerable insight into the figure of Set, the Lord of the Oases, by underscoring the traits, the personality traits, and the cultural traits that were associated with these places, and explained to me why this figure was demonized by the settled agricultural peoples along the Nile. And that's something that I took with me as we crossed the span of desert between these oases and back to the Nile Valley. It's very easy if you're traveling on a bus with air conditioning and water in a cooler full of ice. It's very easy to look out and think that you understand the desert. It's when you realize that this was not an afternoon's trip, but a trip of days, accompanied by donkeys who carried the water, but you had to share your water with them. It's when you realize how difficult it must have been, how treacherous it must have been, the shifting sands covering the tracks. When you realize that they must have relied heavily on orientation via the night sky. When you realize that the sun wasn't your friend. All of these things make the worship of Set, it gives it context, it makes it understandable in a way that you can't pick up from just reading books about it. And so while I regard myself as extraordinarily fortunate to have been able to visit Egypt before the outbreak of political instability, which is ongoing, I would emphasize to anyone pursuing magical work to think carefully about the context in which their magical work arose. Think carefully about that. Strive to find ways to understand and deepen your comprehension of that. Because by seeing through the ancient magicians, seeing their world through their eyes, you are equipped to look around your world here and now through strange eyes and to see what others don't. The buzz took us back to the Nile and the settled lands. I remember the last extraordinary sight of that 2004 tour. We arrived at the Cairo airport, which is in the suburbs, and built on what was Heliopolis. And as you enter the airport, there's a roundabout where you can see the last standing pillar of Heliopolis. And I looked at that pillar and I felt like a pilgrim who had arrived at their destination after a very, very long and arcane journey.
Excellent. And then from that point, you ended up coming back to the States, and it was after this that you were elected by the Council of Nine within the Temple of Set to be the next High Priestess. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Very good.
That is correct. I had presented a slideshow which was extracted from our considerable collection of photos. The slideshow was oriented to tracing the influence of the cult of Set. Such evidences as could still be seen in the monuments and at various sites. And I spoke of our experiences there. I was also able at that point to announce the publication, since there had been a delay actually going to press, the publication of my academic work. And it was then that I was approached and asked about whether I would be willing to serve as High Priestess of Set. And it was then that I realized, reflecting on all of these things, that I had been most strangely equipped, that I had not gone into this imagining that I would be the High Priestess of Set someday. Rather, it was a matter of having done these things, having sought the connections between the past and the present, and considered what that meant for the future, having brought a variety of magical concepts and tools into the temple, having done this with the intensity such that I could speak to Egyptologists about what I found, having traveled with Egyptologists to their digs. All of this led me to reflect on the path by which I had come to the temple, the things that I had done, and the things that I might do as the High Priestess of Set. What would that mean? I served as High Priestess of Set for 9 years. During that time, I formulated an understanding of the purpose of magical and esoteric schools. I saw that our description of our work as part of the Aeon of Set as something more than a mystical metaphor. If a magical school is serving its initiates, if it is a vehicle for initiation, those individuals pursue that school, work in that school, pursue that mode of initiation, will do extraordinary things. They will fulfill dreams and make them reality. They will do things beyond anything that they were originally trained for. They will do this not in any one way, but in diverse ways. I looked at the temple and I said to myself, I think I know what this is. The transition that we've lived through is the transition where humanity's been able to see itself from the earth from an external point of perspective. We'd entered or embarked on something very new. The rate of change is extraordinary. The possibilities and fluidity of options available to people is something undreamed of just a few decades ago. I looked at all this and reflected on it and saw that we were in a kind of renaissance. That the last time, the European Renaissance involved an influx of ideas from the past, much searching after the knowledge of classical antiquity, much fascination with Hermetic magical philosophy, a great deal of transformative intellectual and social activity. That these things had catalyzed a new age in Europe, that magicians had been at the forefront. The place was full of magicians at the time. You look to the court of Rudolf II in Prague, alchemists, astrologers, the visit by the sage John Dee. Mm-hmm. That these were people involved in magic. Magic today should have that transformative impact. It should reflect that opening of an age. And for me, that meant encouraging people to pursue a variety of expressions of their magical activity. It meant that rather than clinging to our existing texts, that we should encourage people to write their own texts and express their understanding, whether it be in fiction or nonfiction. That there should be music, there should be sculpture, there should be science, there should be philosophy. It was my work during those 9 years not to pronounce a goal that everybody should follow me to, but to tell people at the end of the workings during our annual gatherings that when the doors opened, that all the magic that had been worked at those gatherings should flow out with them, to be carried into the world, to fuel their work. I like to think that it was because of this focus on encouraging the manifestation of magic, the realization of these things in one's life. I like to think it was because of this that the temple's experience during that 9 years was relatively tranquil compared to the average magical order. When there is a concentration on charters and proclamations and of the trappings of attainment, rather than attainment itself, one sees witch wars, small group political dynamics, a great deal of political noise. But when people treat their magical work as foremost and bring to their gatherings basically the tales of their victories and defeats, tales of their attainments, wonders that they have encountered.
And
when
the products of those things.
Yes.
We have artists, we have scholars, we have people who present things very similar to the archaeoastronomical work and your Egyptian travel work that you have done. Yes, certainly.
The thing is that this tells me that people have transformed themselves and that the school is fulfilling its magical and philosophic mission. When people attain their dreams, when they become more than their dreams. During that period, 9 years, I attended gatherings in Hawaii, Canada, the United States, Ireland, Northern Ireland, England, Finland, Germany, and Austria. Only circumstances prevented me from traveling to South Africa and Australia. But I was gratified during my 9 years to see the temple expand in those places and to correspond with individuals there and to see some of them visit the States. So I guess that looking back on those 9 years, I would say that I perceived the mission of the temple and managed to pursue that to the best of my ability and to the benefit the initiates of the temple. And I also had a rollicking good time doing it. My current work is focused on, now that I have stepped down from that position, I've returned to looking at the psyche and the night sky. I have been working on a book to summarize some of the insights, tools, and possibilities that I have taken from almost 20 years of involvement with this area. And I'm also continuing to interact with a variety of sentients and see the seeds planted still growing, still thriving. It's a rare thing, an extraordinary privilege to have been allowed that position and to have carried out that mission.
Certainly. Well, I know that in my tenure here within the temple, your influence has helped facilitate an excellent environment for being able to pursue initiation in the way that we do on the left-hand path. So thank you for those contributions. I'd like to go ahead and close with one additional question for you. And I think it pertains to most of the people who'd be listening to this interview. And that is, for those who are maybe new Setians, or for those who are embarking on the left-hand path, do you have any advice?
The advice I'd give is to trust your intuition, to reflect on all that you see, and don't be afraid to trust your judgment. Ultimately, the left-hand path isn't about a particular school, a particular organization, a particular teacher. It's ultimately about whether you become the ruling power in your own life. Avoid what weakens you in this. Pursue what strengthens you. That's the advice that I would give.
Well, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight, Magistra Hardy. Again, you've been a wonderful influence on me in my initiation and on the initiation of just countless others, both within and outside of the temple of Set. And I suppose that's really all we have to say for tonight. So.
Adept Little, I've enjoyed this conversation. There are a lot of things that I've disclosed here that I've not discussed so far in any conversation with anyone. It's an extraordinary thing to be a magician. More extraordinary to be, for a time, the leader and servant of magicians.
Well, thank you once again, and to all those who are listening, thank you for tuning in to this Comcast, and be certain to continue to Kepher and remanifest.
You've been listening to KHPR, the Voice of Darkness. If you have any questions or comments, you can email them to us at khpr@kepher.org. Thank you for listening, and we hope that we've been able to bring about some change for you.